Sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones who could save us. Sometimes the hands we think are stained with guilt are the very hands that can heal our deepest wounds. In the town of Ravenshoe, a giant stranger named Thatcher Cain was found standing over a dead body with blood on his hands. The townspeople saw a killer who deserved to hang. Judge Bartholomew Ewell wasted no time sentencing him to death by sunrise. But hours before the execution, the judge's beloved daughter Catherine collapsed with a deadly fever. No doctor could help her. As death crept closer to the child, a desperate plea echoed through the town for anyone with healing knowledge. From his prison cell, the condemned man spoke his first words, "I can help her." What happened next changed everything. A giant's gentle hands working ancient remedies. A father's heart torn between justice and mercy, and a town about to discover they nearly hanged the wrong man. But what really happened that bloody night, and who truly wanted Thatcher Cain dead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Ravenshoe, a frontier town that had grown from a single trading post into a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls. Wooden buildings lined the thoroughfare like weathered sentinels, the general store with its creaking porch, Murphy's saloon with its bat-wing doors that never quite closed properly, and the modest church where Reverend Patterson held services every Sunday morning. At the far end of the street stood the courthouse, a two-story structure that served as both seat of justice and symbol of civilization's fragile hold on this corner of the territory. Judge Bartholomew Ewell had arrived in Ravenshoe 3 years prior, part of the circuit court system that brought law to the scattered settlements of the frontier. A man of 52 with graying temples and steady hands, he had earned the respect of the townspeople through his fair judgments and unwavering dedication to order. His late wife, Margaret, had passed during a harsh winter 2 years before, leaving him to raise their 12-year-old daughter Catherine alone. Catherine Ewell possessed the kind of bright intelligence that made adults pause in their conversations to listen when she spoke. Her auburn hair caught the light like copper pennies, and her green eyes held a curiosity about the world that reminded everyone of her mother. She spent her mornings helping at the church, organizing the small library that Reverend Patterson had assembled, and her afternoons reading beneath the oak tree behind their modest home. The townspeople had watched her grow from a shy child into a thoughtful young woman who seemed to understand that life held both beauty and sorrow in equal measure. "Papa, do you think Mr. Henderson will ever learn to read properly?" Catherine asked one evening, looking up from the primer she had been using to help the elderly blacksmith with his letters. Judge Ewell smiled, setting down his legal papers. "Some folks take longer to find their way with words, sweetheart, but Tom Henderson has hands that can shape iron into art. We all have our gifts." These quiet moments had become precious to the judge. In a world where his days were filled with disputes over land rights, cattle theft, and the occasional violent crime, his daughter's gentle perspective reminded him why law existed not merely to punish, but to protect the good in people and preserve the possibility of redemption. The morning Thatcher Cain rode into Ravenshoe, the town was preparing for the annual harvest festival. Martha Cunningham, who ran the saloon with a firm hand and a generous heart, was organizing the women to prepare food for the celebration. Sheriff Morrison, a steady man in his 40s with a weathered face and careful eyes, was coordinating with the local merchants to ensure the festivities proceeded without incident. Dr. Hamilton, the town's physician, had arrived from back east 5 years earlier, bringing with him modern medical knowledge and a genuine desire to serve the frontier community. His practice occupied the ground floor of a building next to the general store, and his living quarters were upstairs. He had delivered most of the babies born in Ravenshoe and closed the eyes of many who had passed on, earning him a place of honor in the community's heart. Into this peaceful scene rode a man who seemed to dwarf his horse. Thatcher Cain stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor and hands that looked capable of splitting wood with their bare strength. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. He wore simple, clothesa-worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, dark pants, and boots that had seen countless miles of trail. What struck the townspeople most was not his size, but his silence. He nodded politely when greeted, paid for his room at the boarding house with few words, and took his meals alone at a corner table in Martha's saloon. His saddlebags, which he carried personally to his room, seemed to hold more than the usual travelling gear, but he offered no explanation of their contents or his purpose in Ravenshoe. "He's running from something," whispered Mrs. Patterson to Martha as they watched the giant stranger through the saloon's front window. "Men don't get that quiet unless they're carrying guilt." Martha, who had seen her share of drifters and desperados, wasn't so sure. "Maybe he's just tired," she replied, wiping down a glass with practiced efficiency. "Road can wear a man down to nothing but bones and silence." Sheriff Morrison made it his business to introduce himself to newcomers, particularly those who looked like they might be capable of trouble. When he approached Thatcher's table that first evening, the big man looked up with eyes that held neither hostility nor fear, just a deep weariness that spoke of losses that couldn't be easily explained. "Welcome to Ravenshoe," Morrison said, settling into the chair across from Thatcher. "I'm Sheriff Morrison. Mind if I ask what brings you to our town?" Thatcher studied the sheriff's face for a long moment before answering. "Looking for someone," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Someone who might have known my mother." "Your mother?" "Eleanor Cain. She lived in these parts, maybe 25-30 years ago." Morrison searched his memory, but came up empty. "Can't say I recall that name, but I've only been here 10 years. You might want to talk to Samuel Graves at the general store. He's been in Ravenshoe longer than most, knows the history of folks who came and went." Thatcher nodded his thanks and returned to his meal, effectively ending the conversation. Morrison left with the impression that the stranger was searching for something more than just information about his mother. He was looking for a piece of himself that had been lost. Samuel Graves was a thin man with nervous hands and eyes that darted around like a bird watching for predators. He had run the general store for 15 years, arriving in Ravenshoe with enough money to buy the business and a past that no one questioned too closely. When Thatcher approached him the following morning, Graves seemed unusually agitated. "Eleanor Cain," Graves repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in many years. You knew her?" Graves glanced around the store, ensuring they were alone. "I knew of her. She had a reputation as a healer, lived up in the mountains, kept to herself mostly. Some folks said she was touched by God. Others whispered different things." "What kind of different things?" "People fear what they don't understand," Graves said, his hands fidgeting with a bolt of cloth. "Your mother could heal ailments that stumped the regular doctors, made some folks nervous, if you catch my meaning." Thatcher's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "Where is she now?" "Dead, I'm afraid. Must be 15 years now. Heard she died up in her cabin during a bad winter. Alone, from what I was told." The news didn't seem to surprise Thatcher, but grief settled over his features like a shadow. "I see. Did she ever mention a man, someone she might have cared for?" Graves became even more agitated, his eyes darting toward the door. "That's not something I'd know about. Eleanor kept her private affairs private. Look, I've got customers waiting." "I understand you might know something about my father," Thatcher said quietly, and the intensity in his voice made Graves freeze. "Your father? I don't know nothing about that. Nothing at all." But Thatcher could see the lie in the man's eyes, could read the fear that had nothing to do with old gossip and everything to do with secrets that someone wanted to keep buried. Before he could press further, the store's bell chimed as Mrs. Patterson entered, bringing their conversation to an abrupt end. That evening, Thatcher sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The weight of his mother's memory pressed against his chest like a stone. Eleanor Cain had been gifted with the ability to heal, but her gift had made her an outcast in the mountain community where she lived. She had raised Thatcher alone, teaching him her knowledge of herbs and remedies, but she had never spoken of his father, except to say that he was a good man who had made a difficult choice. "Someday you'll understand," she had told him during one of their last conversations. Sometimes good people find themselves in situations where there are no perfect answers, only the choice to do what they believe is right at the time. Now, sitting in the growing darkness of Ravenshoe, Thatcher wondered if his journey to find his father was worth the pain it might bring. But something in Samuel Graves' frightened eyes told him that the truth was here, waiting to be uncovered, and that some secrets were too heavy for one man to carry alone. The next morning would bring the discovery that would change everything. Samuel Graves would be found dead behind his store, and Thatcher Cain would be standing over the body with blood on his hands, no memory of how he got there, and no words to explain the inexplicable. The town's peaceful routine would shatter like glass, and the giant stranger who had come looking for his past would find himself facing a future that might end at the wrong end of a rope. But for now, in the quiet evening air of Ravenshoe, Thatcher Cain sat alone with his thoughts, unaware that his search for truth was about to collide with forces that had been waiting years for him to arrive. In her room above the courthouse, Catherine Ewell read her book by lamplight, her delicate fingers clutching a silver locket that contained her mother's portraiture locket that would soon become the center of a desperate father's world when death threatened to claim his only remaining treasure. The stage was set for a confrontation between justice and mercy, between the truth people wanted to believe and the reality they were afraid to face. And at the center of it all would be a giant of a man whose gentle hands held the power to heal and whose silence held secrets that could destroy the very people he had come to find. The morning mist still clung to the mountains when young Billy Patterson discovered Samuel Graves' body behind the general store. The boy had been making his usual rounds, collecting eggs from the chickens that roamed freely behind the businesses, when he stumbled upon a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Samuel lay sprawled among the wooden crates and discarded barrels, his thin frame twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood had pooled beneath his head where it had struck the corner of a heavy shipping crate. His eyes stared sightlessly at the dawn sky, and his nervous hands, which had fidgeted with every conversation, were finally still. Standing over the body, as motionless as a carved statue, was Thatcher Cain. The giant's massive hands were stained with blood, and his clothes bore dark smears that could only have come from close contact with the deceased. He made no attempt to flee when Billy's scream brought Sheriff Morrison running. He simply stood there, his weathered face expressionless, waiting for whatever judgment the world would bring. "Step away from the body," Morrison commanded, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. The sheriff's voice carried the authority of years of dealing with violence, but his eyes held a confusion that came from seeing something that didn't quite fit the pattern he expected. Thatcher moved slowly, deliberately, raising his blood-stained hands where Morrison could see them. "I found him like this," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet timbre it had held during their earlier conversation. "With blood on your hands? I checked for signs of life. There were none." Morrison studied the scene carefully, his trained eyes taking in every detail. The blood spatter on the crates suggested that Graves had fallen backward, striking his head with considerable force. But the pattern didn't look right for a simple accident, and the defensive wounds on Graves's arms suggested he had been fighting for his life. "Did anyone see you here before the boy found you?" Thatcher shook his head. "I heard a commotion, came to investigate, found him as you see." "Where were you last night?" "My room at the boarding house. Mrs. Henley can confirm." But when Morrison later questioned the elderly boarding house proprietor, her memory proved frustratingly vague. She had heard footsteps on the stairs sometime after midnight, but couldn't say whether they belonged to Thatcher going out or coming in. The giant stranger had paid for his room in advance and kept to himself, making it difficult to establish his whereabouts during the crucial hours. By noon, word of the murder had spread through Ravenshoe like wildfire. The townspeople gathered in small groups, their voices hushed, but their opinions loud and clear. A stranger had come to their peaceful community, and now one of their own was dead. The arithmetic of frontier justice was simple and unforgiving. Judge Ewell arrived on the afternoon stage, having been summoned from his circuit duties in the neighboring county. He found the town in a state of agitation that bordered on mob mentality. Outside the jail, a crowd had gathered, their faces grim with the certainty that swift justice was the only justice worth having. "Hang him now and save the territory the cost of a trial," shouted Tom Henderson, the blacksmith whose massive arms were still streaked with soot from his forge. "What's the point of waiting?" agreed Mrs. Patterson, her face flushed with righteous anger. "We all know what happened here." Judge Ewell pushed through the crowd with the quiet authority that had earned him respect throughout the territory. His grey hair was disheveled from travel, and his face showed the weariness of a man who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for both evil and good. Inside the jail, he found Thatcher Cain sitting calmly on the narrow cot in the single cell. The big man looked up when the judge entered, and their eyes met in a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Something flickered in the judge's expression, a shadow of recognition that he quickly pushed aside. "I am Judge Bartholomew Ewell," he said formally. "You are charged with the murder of Samuel Graves. How do you plead?" "Not guilty," Thatcher replied, his voice steady and clear. "Can you provide any evidence of your innocence?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the judge's face with an intensity that made Ewell uncomfortable. "Would it matter if I could?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications that neither man was ready to explore. Outside, the crowd's voices grew louder, demanding immediate satisfaction for their grief and fear. "Every man deserves a fair trial," Judge Ewell said finally. "Even a stranger with blood on his hands. Especially a stranger with blood on his hands." But fairness proved to be a luxury that Ravenshoe could not afford. The evidence, while circumstantial, painted a clear picture of guilt. Thatcher had been found at the scene with the victim's blood on his person. He had no alibi for the time of death, and his presence in town coincided suspiciously with the first violent crime Ravenshoe had seen in over 2 years. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. Dr. Hamilton testified about the nature of Graves' injuries, confirming that the merchant had died from a blow to the head that was consistent with striking the shipping crate. Sheriff Morrison presented the evidence of Thatcher's presence at the scene and his inability to account for his whereabouts during the critical hours. When asked to speak in his own defense, Thatcher rose slowly to his full height, towering over the makeshift courtroom that had been assembled in the church. The assembled townspeople leaned forward, expecting either a confession or a desperate plea for mercy. Instead, he spoke only a few words. "I did not kill Samuel Graves, but I understand why you believe I did." His calm acceptance of their judgment seemed to unnerve the crowd more than protests of innocence would have. There was something in his manner that suggested a man who had made peace with injustice long before he arrived in Ravenshoe. Judge Ewell felt the weight of the community's expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. These were good people, frightened people, who needed to believe that order could be restored with swift and certain punishment. The evidence supported their conclusion, and his duty as a judge was to follow the law, not to chase shadows of doubt that might exist only in his own troubled conscience. "Thatcher Cain," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "you have been found guilty of the murder of Samuel Graves. You are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. The execution will take place at sunrise tomorrow." A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the crowd, but it was tinged with something that might have been relief. Justice would be served, order would be restored, and life in Ravenshoe could return to its peaceful routine. As the townspeople filed out of the church, talking in low voices about the swift resolution of their crisis, Judge Ewell lingered behind. Something about the condemned man troubled him, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way Thatcher had looked at him during the proceedings, not with hatred or fear, but with something that resembled understanding, even forgiveness. That evening, as carpenters worked by torchlight to construct the gallows in the town square, Judge Ewell sat in his study, trying to concentrate on legal papers. But his mind kept returning to the stranger's calm acceptance of death, to the quiet dignity with which he had faced a hostile crowd, and to the nagging sense that something important had been overlooked in their rush to judgment. Catherine knocked softly on his door, carrying a tray with his dinner. At 12, she possessed an intuitive understanding of her father's moods that often surprised him. "You're troubled about the trial," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "Justice isn't always easy, sweetheart," he replied, managing a weary smile. "Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions based on imperfect information. But you believe he's guilty?" Judge Ewell paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. In his daughter's innocent question, he heard an echo of his own doubts. "The evidence says he is." "That's not what I asked, Papa." Her perceptiveness reminded him painfully of her mother, who had possessed the same ability to cut through his legal rhetoric to the heart of moral questions. Margaret would have asked the same thing, and she would not have been satisfied with evasion. "I believe in the law," he said finally, "and the law says that when a man is found over a dead body with blood on his hands, and no reasonable explanation for his presence, justice demands consequences." Catherine nodded solemnly, but her green eyes held a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "Mama used to say that the hardest thing about being grown up was knowing the difference between what's legal and what's right." Her words stayed with him long after she had kissed him goodnight and retired to her room. Outside his window, he could hear the hammering of nails as the gallows took shape, each blow a reminder that by sunrise a man would be dead, man whose eyes had held no malice, whose voice had carried no hatred, whose very presence seemed to embody a quiet strength that had nothing to do with violence. From his cell, Thatcher could hear the construction as well. He sat on his narrow cot, his large hands folded in his lap, staring at the small barred window that offered a view of the mountains where his mother had lived and died. In a worn leather pouch that Sheriff Morrison had allowed him to keep it contained only dried herbs and what appeared to be medical supplies lay, the tools of healing that Thatcher Cain had taught him to use. Tomorrow he would die for a crime he had not committed, and the truth about his father would die with him. Samuel Graves had been about to reveal that truth when someone had silenced him forever. Now Thatcher faced the same fate that had claimed his mother death in solitude, misunderstood and misjudged by people who feared what they could not comprehend. But he harbored no bitterness toward the townspeople of Ravenshoe. They were doing what they believed was right, following their understanding of justice and order. His mother had taught him that healing required forgiveness, and that forgiveness was not dependent on deserving. As the night deepened and the hammering finally stopped, Thatcher closed his eyes and tried to find peace in the knowledge that his search, whatever its outcome, would soon be over. He could not have known that fate had one more test, waiting a test that would require him to choose between his own life and the life of an innocent child, between the safety of silence and the risk of revealing the very truth he had come to find. The dinner hour at the Ewell house typically brought a sense of peace that helped wash away the weight of judicial responsibilities. Judge Ewell had always cherished these quiet moments with Catherine, when the complexities of law gave way to the simple pleasures of fatherly conversation. Tonight, however, the shadow of tomorrow's execution hung over their meal like a storm cloud. Catherine picked at her food, her usual appetite diminished by the day's somber events. She had helped Reverend Patterson prepare the church for the trial, sweeping the aisles and arranging the chairs, and the gravity of what she had witnessed seemed to have settled into her young bones. "Papa," she said quietly, setting down her fork, "do you think Mr. Cain has family somewhere, people who are waiting for him to come home?" The question struck Judge Ewell with unexpected force. In his focus on evidence and legal procedure, he had not considered the human connections that might be severed by tomorrow's rope. "I don't know, sweetheart. He mentioned searching for someone who knew his mother, but beyond that..." Catherine's face suddenly contorted in pain, and she pressed her hand to her forehead. "I feel strange, Papa. My head hurts, and I'm so very hot." Judge Ewell was on his feet immediately, crossing to her chair and placing his hand on her forehead. The heat that met his palm sent a spike of fear through his chest. Catherine's skin burned with fever, and in the lamplight, her cheeks had taken on an alarming flush. "We need to get you to bed immediately," he said, scooping her into his arms despite her protests that she could walk. Her body felt fragile against his chest, and the heat radiating from her seemed to intensify with each passing moment. By the time he had carried her upstairs and settled her in bed, Catherine's condition had worsened dramatically. She complained of severe headaches and chills that made her teeth chatter despite the fever that made her skin burn to the touch. When she tried to drink the water he offered, she immediately vomited, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. "I'll fetch Dr. Hamilton," Judge Ewell said, but Catherine's hand shot out to grasp his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't leave me, Papa. I'm frightened." Her green eyes, so bright and intelligent just hours before, now held a glassy quality that terrified him more than any criminal he had ever faced in court. He could see his late wife in those eyes, and the memory of Margaret's final illness came rushing back with devastating clarity. "I won't leave you," he promised, settling into the chair beside her bed. "But we need the doctor to look at you." Within minutes, Mrs. Patterson arrived, having been summoned by Judge Ewell's urgent message. The Reverend's wife took one look at Catherine and immediately dispatched her son to fetch Dr. Hamilton while she began the practical work of caring for a sick child. Dr. Hamilton arrived with his medical bag and the grim expression of a man who had seen too many frontier fevers take children before their time. His examination was thorough but quick, his experienced hands checking Catherine's pulse, listening to her breathing and feeling for swollen glands. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, his voice professionally calm but his eyes troubled. "It came on during dinner," Judge Ewell replied. "She was fine this afternoon. A little quiet, perhaps, but she seemed well." Dr. Hamilton opened his bag and began preparing his standard treatments. These frontier fevers can move quickly, especially in children. "We'll start with willow bark tea for the fever and see if we can get some laudanum into her for the pain." But as the night wore on, Catherine's condition continued to deteriorate. The willow bark tea came back up almost immediately, and the laudanum seemed to have no effect on her pain. She thrashed in her bed, calling out for her deceased mother and speaking in fragments that made no sense. "There's more we can try," Dr. Hamilton said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Bloodletting might relieve some of the pressure." "No," Judge Ewell's voice was sharp with panic. "She's already weak. We're not taking any blood from her." By midnight, word of Catherine's illness had spread through Ravenshoe. The townspeople, who had spent the day focused on Samuel Graves' murder and the impending execution, now found themselves confronted with a different kind of crisis. Catherine Ewell was beloved by the entire community. She had helped teach children to read, visited the elderly, and brought a kind of innocent joy to their harsh frontier existence. Martha Cunningham arrived with homemade broth, though Catherine couldn't keep it down. Tom Henderson's wife brought quilts to help with the chills. Even people who rarely darkened the church door found themselves offering prayers for the judge's daughter. "Has anyone tried sending for Dr. Morrison from Canyon Creek?" Martha suggested. "He's supposed to know about diseases that the regular doctors can't treat." "Canyon Creek is a 2-day ride," Dr. Hamilton replied wearily. "I'm not sure." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but everyone in the room understood. He wasn't sure Catherine had 2 days. As the hours crawled by, Judge Ewell found himself keeping a helpless vigil beside his daughter's bed. Her fever showed no signs of breaking, and her lucid moments became increasingly rare. During one such moment, she looked up at him with startling clarity. "Papa, the man in the jail, have you thought that maybe God sent him here for a reason?" Before he could ask what she meant, Catherine's eyes rolled back, and she fell into another fevered delirium. But her words echoed in his mind with troubling persistence. All evening, as he had watched his daughter suffer, he had been tormented by thoughts of the man who would hang at sunrise. There was something about Thatcher Cain that didn't fit the image of a cold-blooded killer, something in his manner that suggested depth and wisdom rather than violence. Meanwhile, in the jail cell across town, Thatcher Cain sat awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of a community in distress. Word of Catherine's illness had reached even the condemned man's ears, carried by the whispered conversations of people passing beneath his barred window. Sheriff Morrison had said little during his evening rounds, but his grim expression spoke volumes. The child who had brightened the entire town with her presence was fighting for her life, and all the medical knowledge available to them seemed powerless to help her. Thatcher's weathered hands moved instinctively to the leather pouch that contained his mother's healing supplies. Eleanor Cain had taught him to recognize the signs of different ailments, to understand how the body's systems work together, and to know which natural remedies could bring relief when conventional medicine failed. From the symptoms, he had overheard sudden onset, high fever, severe headaches, vomiting, and delirium. He could make an educated guess about what ailed the judge's daughter. The patterns suggested a particular type of fever that struck quickly and struck hard, but one that could be treated if you knew the right combination of herbs and understood how to prepare them properly. His mother's voice seemed to whisper to him across the years, "Sometimes, son, the Lord puts knowledge in our hands, not for our own benefit, but so we can serve others when their need is greatest." As dawn approached and the sounds of gallows preparation resumed outside his window, Thatcher made a decision that would change the course of everyone's lives. When Sheriff Morrison made his final rounds before the execution, the big man was standing at the bars of his cell, his dark eyes holding a determination that hadn't been there before. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I need to speak with Judge Ewell." "It's a little late for appeals," Morrison replied, though not unkindly. "The judge has his hands full right now anyway. It's about his daughter. I might be able to help her." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face the condemned man. "What do you mean?" "My mother was a healer. She taught me to recognize certain fevers, to know what treatments might work when the regular doctors can't help." Thatcher's voice carried no desperation, no hint of bargaining for his life, just the quiet confidence of someone who possessed knowledge that might save a child. "And you're offering this, why? Hoping the judge might commute your sentence?" Thatcher shook his head. "I'm offering because a child is dying, and I might be able to help her. What happens to me after that is in God's hands." Sheriff Morrison studied the big man's face, searching for deception or manipulation. What he found instead was the same quiet integrity that had puzzled him since Thatcher's arrival in Ravenshoe. This was not the demeanor of a man trying to cheat the gallows. This was someone genuinely concerned about the welfare of a sick child. "I'll talk to the judge," Morrison said finally, "but I can't promise anything." In the blood-stained ledger that had been found among Samuel Graves's effects, Sheriff Morrison had discovered troubling evidence that the merchant's death might not be as straightforward as it appeared. The book revealed gambling debts, mysterious payments, and financial arrangements that suggested Graves had been involved in activities far more complex than simple storekeeping. One entry in particular had caught Morrison's attention, a large payment scheduled for the day after Graves' death, with only the cryptic notation, "Final Settlement, TC." Matter. The initials could refer to Thatcher Cain, but the nature of the settlement remained unclear. As Morrison walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward Judge Ewell's house, he carried both the condemned man's offer to help and growing doubts about the certainty of Thatcher's guilt. The blood-stained ledger tucked under his arm might hold clues to the real story behind Samuel Graves's death, if anyone could spare the time to investigate while a child's life hung in the balance. The convergence of these crises, Catherine's illness, Thatcher's impending execution, and the mysteries surrounding Graves' murder would force everyone in Ravenshoe to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice and mercy sometimes demanded impossible choices. When Sheriff Morrison arrived at the Ewell house in the grey light before dawn, he found a scene of quiet desperation. Dr. Hamilton sat slumped in a chair beside Catherine's bed, his medical bag open but his face bearing the defeated expression of a man who had exhausted his knowledge. Judge Ewell knelt beside his daughter's bedside, holding her fevered hand and whispering prayers that seemed to echo off the walls without response. Catherine's condition had worsened throughout the night. Her fever had climbed even higher, and periods of delirium now outweighed her moments of lucidity. Her breathing had become labored, and her skin had taken on an alarming pallor despite the heat radiating from her body. "Judge Ewell," Morrison said softly from the doorway, "I need to speak with you." The judge looked up with red-rimmed eyes that spoke of a night spent watching his child slip away from him. "If it's about the execution, Sheriff, It's about Catherine," Morrison interrupted gently. "The condemned man says he might be able to help her." For a moment, Judge Ewell seemed not to comprehend the words. Then his expression shifted through disbelief, hope, and suspicion in rapid succession. "What do you mean?" "He claims his mother was a healer, that he knows about fevers like this. Says he might know treatments that could help when regular medicine fails." Dr. Hamilton looked up sharply. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we're dealing with a dangerous fever here. The last thing we need is some folk remedy administered by a man who's about to hang for murder." "What folk remedy?" Morrison asked, his tone suggesting that Dr. Hamilton's dismissal might be premature. Before the doctor could respond, Judge Ewell stood slowly, his gaze fixed on Morrison with an intensity that made the sheriff uncomfortable. "What exactly did he say?" Morrison recounted Thatcher's offer, emphasizing the condemned man's calm demeanor and his apparent, genuine concern for Catherine's welfare. As he spoke, he watched the judge's face carefully, noting the conflict between parental desperation and judicial skepticism. This could be nothing more than a condemned man's attempt to delay his execution. Dr. Hamilton warned, "I've seen plenty of frontier charlatans who claim healing abilities they don't possess. And I've seen children die from fevers that conventional medicine couldn't treat," Judge Ewell replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "If there's even a possibility—" "Judge," Morrison interrupted quietly, "there's something else. I've been going through Samuel Graves' ledger, and there are some irregularities that suggest his murder might not be as clear-cut as we thought." He pulled out the blood-stained accounting book and opened it to the relevant pages. "Look at these entries. Graves was involved in financial arrangements that he kept hidden from normal business records. There's mention of a large payment scheduled for the day after his death, with a notation about TC matter." Judge Ewell studied the ledger entries, his legal mind automatically analyzing the implications. This suggests that Graves's death might have been connected to these hidden financial dealings. Exactly. And if that's the case, then we might be about to hang an innocent man while the real killer goes free. From the bed, Catherine's voice cut through their conversation with startling clarity. "Papa, please let him try to help me." All three men turned to look at the child, who had opened her eyes and was regarding them with a lucidity that hadn't been present for hours. Her face was still flushed with fever, but her green eyes held the same wisdom that had always seemed beyond her years. "Sweetheart, you don't understand," Judge Ewell began. "I understand that I'm very sick, and that Dr. Hamilton's medicines aren't helping." Catherine's voice was weak but determined. "If this man has knowledge that might save my life, why would you not let him try?" The simple logic of a child's question cut through the adult's complex reasoning like a knife. Dr. Hamilton opened his mouth to object, but Catherine's penetrating gaze silenced him. "What harm could it do?" she asked. "If I'm dying anyway, what's the worst that could happen?" Judge Ewell felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. His duty as a judge demanded that he not show favoritism to a condemned man, but his heart as a father screamed for him to explore every possible means of saving his daughter's life. "If I allow this," he said finally, "it would have to be under heavy guard, and Dr. Hamilton would have to supervise everything." "Of course," Morrison agreed quickly. "I'll have 2 armed deputies with him at all times, and he'll be shackled except when he needs his hands free to work." Dr. Hamilton sighed heavily. I suppose there's no harm in letting him examine her, as long as I approve any treatments before they're administered. Within an hour, Thatcher Cain found himself in the surreal position of being escorted from his death cell to the bedside of a dying child. The irony was not lost on him. He was about to attempt to save the daughter of the man who had condemned him to hang. The deputies flanked him as he climbed the stairs to Catherine's room, his shackled hands carrying the worn leather pouch that contained his mother's healing supplies. As he entered the bedroom, his eyes immediately went to the small figure in the bed, and his expression softened with genuine concern. "Hello, Catherine," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying a gentleness that surprised everyone present. "I'm Thatcher. I'd like to help you feel better, if you'll let me." Catherine studied his face with the same penetrating gaze she had directed at the adults earlier. "You're the man they say killed Mr. Graves." "Yes, that's what they say." "Did you?" Thatcher met her eyes without flinching. "No, child, I did not." Something in his manner seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and extended her small hand toward him. "Then please help me, Mr. Thatcher." The big man moved carefully to her bedside, mindful of the armed guards and the suspicious doctor watching his every move. When he placed his large hand gently on Catherine's forehead, the contrast between his size and her fragility was striking. "Tell me about how you've been feeling," he said, his voice taking on the calm, professional tone of someone accustomed to examining patients. As Catherine described her symptoms, Thatcher's experienced hands checked her pulse, felt for swollen glands, and examined her eyes and throat with the practiced movements of someone who had learned healing at his mother's side. The deputies and Dr. Hamilton watched tensely, but there was nothing threatening in the big man's actions, only the careful attention of a healer assessing a patient. "This fever is dangerous," Thatcher said finally, addressing Dr. Hamilton, "but it's not beyond treatment if we act quickly. The pattern suggests what my mother called mountain fever. It strikes fast and hard, but it responds to the right combination of herbs if they're prepared correctly." "What herbs?" Dr. Hamilton asked skeptically. Thatcher opened his leather pouch and began removing small bundles of dried plants. "Red willow bark, but prepared differently than you've been using it. Prairie sage for the respiratory symptoms. And most importantly, a root that grows in high mountain meadows. My mother called it fever break root." He held up a gnarled piece of dried root that looked unremarkable to the untrained eye. "This needs to be boiled in a specific way, with precise timing and temperature. Too little, and it won't work. Too much, and it becomes toxic." Judge Ewell watched as the condemned man carefully explained each step of the treatment process to Dr. Hamilton, noting how Thatcher's manner had transformed completely. Gone was the silent, resigned prisoner. In his place was a confident healer who spoke with the authority of genuine knowledge. "How do we know this won't make her worse?" Dr. Hamilton asked. Thatcher's dark eyes met the doctor's gaze steadily. "Because I've used these treatments before, and they've saved lives. My mother taught me that healing is about understanding the body's needs, not fighting against them." As he began preparing the remedies under Dr. Hamilton's watchful supervision, Thatcher's movements took on an almost ritualistic quality. He measured herbs with precision learned through years of practice, timing each step according to knowledge passed down through generations of mountain healers. "The key," he explained as he worked, "is to support the body's natural healing processes rather than suppressing them. The fever is trying to burn out the illness, but it's gotten too hot and needs to be brought back into balance." Judge Ewell found himself fascinated, despite his skepticism. This was clearly not the work of a charlatan or desperate man grasping at straws. This was someone who possessed genuine medical knowledge that went far beyond anything available in Ravenshoe. The first remedy was a tea made from the carefully prepared herbs, cooled to a temperature that wouldn't shock Catherine's system. Thatcher tested it himself before offering it to the child, and his gentle encouragement helped her keep down more liquid than she had managed in hours. "Now we wait," he said simply, settling into a chair beside her bed with the calm patience of someone who understood that healing took time. As the morning sun climbed higher and the hour of the scheduled execution passed unnoticed, something remarkable began to happen. Catherine's breathing became less labored, and her restless thrashing gradually gave way to peaceful sleep. The fever that had seemed unstoppable began to show signs of breaking. Dr. Hamilton monitored her vital signs with growing amazement. "Her pulse is stabilizing," he reported quietly, "and her breathing is definitely improving." Judge Ewell felt a mixture of relief and profound confusion. The man he had condemned to death was sitting beside his daughter's bed, his gentle presence somehow bringing peace to the chaos that had consumed their lives. The condemned killer was revealing himself to be something entirely different, a healer whose knowledge might have saved his daughter's life. But even as hope began to bloom in the judge's heart, the weight of justice and law pressed upon his conscience. Regardless of Thatcher's healing abilities, a man was still dead, and the evidence still pointed to the silent giant as the most likely killer. The mysteries in Samuel Graves' ledger might suggest other possibilities, but they didn't constitute proof of innocence. As Catherine slept peacefully for the first time in almost 24 hours, Judge Ewell faced the most difficult decision of his career: how to balance the demands of law with the growing certainty that he might have been wrong about the man who had just saved his daughter's life. By afternoon, Catherine's remarkable recovery had become the talk of Ravenshoe. Words spread through the town like prairie fire. The condemned man had somehow accomplished what Dr. Hamilton's medical training could not. The judge's daughter was not only alive, but sitting up in bed, asking for books and complaining about being confined to her room. The transformation was so dramatic that many townspeople found themselves questioning their earlier certainty about Thatcher Cain's guilt. How could a cold-blooded killer possess such gentle healing abilities? How could a man capable of murder show such tender care for a sick child? Marcus Caldwell arrived in town just as these questions were beginning to circulate among the citizens. A man of considerable wealth and influence, Caldwell owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory and held mortgages on several businesses in Ravenshoe. His arrival was not unexpected. He had been Samuel Graves' primary creditor and had business interests that required the merchant's cooperation. Caldwell was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. Tall and imposing, with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of importance, he carried himself with the confidence of a person accustomed to having his wishes become reality. His pale blue eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who viewed other people primarily as assets or obstacles to his ambitions. "I understand there's been some delay with the execution," Caldwell said to Sheriff Morrison, his tone suggesting that such delays were both inconvenient and unnecessary. "The condemned man was helping with Judge Ewell's daughter," Morrison explained. "She was gravely ill, and his intervention may have saved her life." Caldwell's expression showed no emotion at this news. "How unfortunate about the child's illness. But surely that doesn't change the fact that justice needs to be served for poor Samuel's murder." There was something in Caldwell's manner that made Morrison uncomfortable, a subtle eagerness to see Thatcher hang that went beyond normal civic duty. "We're still investigating some irregularities in Graves' business records," the sheriff said carefully. "What kind of irregularities?" Morrison pulled out the blood-stained ledger and showed Caldwell the entries that had caught his attention. "Hidden financial arrangements, payments that don't correspond to normal store business. This entry here mentions a TC matter and a final settlement scheduled for the day after Graves' death." Caldwell examined the ledger with what appeared to be casual interest, but Morrison noticed a slight tightening around the man's eyes. "Samuel was always involved in various business ventures," Caldwell said dismissively. "I wouldn't read too much into cryptic bookkeeping. You wouldn't happen to know what TC matter might refer to, would you?" "I'm afraid not, Sheriff. Samuel and I discussed cattle purchases and loan payments, nothing more." But Morrison had spent years reading people's faces, and something in Caldwell's too quick denial suggested there was more to the story. The rancher's eagerness to see Thatcher hang, combined with his apparent knowledge of Graves' business affairs, created a pattern that the sheriff found increasingly suspicious. At the Ewell house, Thatcher continued his quiet vigil beside Catherine's bed. The shackles had been removed at Dr. Hamilton's insistence. It was impossible for the big man to properly tend to his patient while chained, but the armed guards remained stationed outside the door. Catherine had awakened from her peaceful sleep with clear eyes and a normal temperature. The fever that had nearly claimed her life had broken completely, leaving behind only the expected weakness that came with recovery from serious illness. "Tell me about your mother," Catherine said, her voice still hoarse but growing stronger by the hour. Thatcher smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. Eleanor Cain could heal ailments that stumped trained doctors, but more than that, she had a gift for healing hearts that had been broken by life's cruelties." "Where did she learn about medicine?" "From her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before that. The knowledge passed down through the women in our family like a precious inheritance. My mother said that healing was both an art and a calling. You couldn't just learn the techniques, you had to understand the sacred responsibility that came with the ability to ease suffering." Catherine listened with the rapt attention she usually reserved for her favorite books. "But you're not a woman. How did you learn?" Thatcher's expression grew somber. "My mother had no daughters, and she said the knowledge was too valuable to die with her. She taught me everything she knew, even though it went against tradition. Healing knows no gender," she used to say. "It only knows need and response." "What happened to her?" "She died alone in her mountain cabin during a harsh winter. The same people who came to her when they needed healing turned their backs on her when she needed help. They feared her gift because they didn't understand it." The parallel between his mother's fate and his own current situation was not lost on either of them. Both had been condemned by people who feared what they couldn't comprehend. Judge Ewell stood in the doorway, listening to this conversation with growing turmoil. The man he had sentenced to death was revealing depths of character and wisdom that challenged everything he thought he knew about guilt and innocence. Thatcher's gentle care for Catherine, his evident knowledge and skill, and the profound sadness in his voice when he spoke of his mother's death, none of these things fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer. "Mr. Thatcher," Catherine said with the directness that often surprised adults, "why did you come to Ravenshoe? Were you really just looking for someone who knew your mother?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes meeting Judge Ewell's gaze over Catherine's head. In that look, the judge saw something that made his breath catch a familiarity that seemed to go beyond their recent encounters. "I was looking for information about my father," Thatcher said finally. "My mother never told me who he was, only that he was a good man who had to make a difficult choice. Samuel Graves was supposed to have information that might help me find him." "And did he?" "We never had the chance to finish our conversation." Judge Ewell felt a chill run down his spine. Something in Thatcher's tone suggested that there had indeed been a conversation with Gravesone that might have revealed secrets that someone wanted to keep buried. Dr. Hamilton chose that moment to arrive for his afternoon examination of Catherine. His assessment confirmed what everyone could see: the child was well on her way to a complete recovery. The fever was gone, her appetite was returning, and her energy levels were steadily improving. "This is remarkable," Dr. Hamilton admitted to Thatcher. "I've never seen a fever break so completely or so quickly. Your mother's remedies were clearly more effective than anything in my medical training." "Different knowledge, not better knowledge," Thatcher replied. "You understand diseases in ways my mother never did. She understood the body's natural healing responses in ways that formal medicine sometimes overlooks. Both approaches have value." The doctor's respect for the condemned man had grown throughout the day. Thatcher's explanations of his treatments showed a sophisticated understanding of how the human body functioned, even if that understanding came from a tradition very different from medical school. As evening approached, Sheriff Morrison returned to the Ewell house with disturbing news. His investigation into Samuel Graves's affairs had uncovered additional irregularities that painted a troubling picture of the merchant's final days. "Graves was being pressured by someone," Morrison reported to Judge Ewell privately. "I found letters hidden in his office that suggest he was being threatened to keep quiet about something." The handwriting isn't clear enough to identify, but the tone is definitely intimidating. Threatened about what? That's not clear, but one letter mentions the boy and warns Graves that some secrets are worth killing for. Given that Thatcher was asking about his father, it's possible that Graves knew something about his parentage that someone wanted to keep hidden. Judge Ewell felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was too troubling to fully accept. If Samuel Graves had been killed to prevent him from revealing information about Thatcher's father, then the condemned man was not only innocent of murder, he was the intended victim of a conspiracy that had cost an innocent man his life. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "I checked with Mrs. Henley at the boarding house about Thatcher's whereabouts the night of the murder. She remembers more clearly now she heard footsteps going out around 10 o'clock and coming back well after midnight. But she also heard voices in the alley behind the boarding house around 11:30. Men talking quietly, but urgently. Did she recognize the voices? No, but she said one of them had what she called a gentleman's way of speaking. Educated, refined. Not the kind of voice you'd expect from a drifter or common criminal. Marcus Caldwell certainly fit that description, and his business relationship with Graves gave him both opportunity and motive if the merchant had been threatening to reveal damaging information. But suspicion was not proof, and Judge Ewell knew that his growing doubts about Thatcher's guilt needed to be supported by evidence that would satisfy a court of law. As night fell over Ravenshoe, the town found itself divided between those who believed justice had been served and those who wondered if they had condemned an innocent man. The gallows still stood in the town square, a grim reminder that the machinery of frontier justice, once set in motion, was difficult to stop. In Catherine's room, Thatcher sat quietly reading to the recovering child from one of her favorite books. His deep voice brought the story to life, and his gentle presence seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace that had been absent since her illness began. Judge Ewell watched from the doorway, struggling with the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. The man who sat beside his daughter's bed was not a killer. He was a healer, a gentle soul who had been shaped by loss and driven by a search for truth that someone was willing to kill to prevent. But admitting that mistake would require Judge Ewell to confront not only his failure as a judge, but the possibility that his rush to judgment had nearly cost an innocent man his life. The weight of that realization pressed upon him like a physical burden, making him question everything he thought he knew about justice, truth, and the responsibilities that came with the power to decide another man's fate. Outside, unknown to any of them, Marcus Caldwell was making plans to ensure that Thatcher Cain would never have the opportunity to reveal the secrets that had died with Samuel Graves. Some truths, Caldwell believed, were too dangerous to be allowed to see the light of day even if silencing them required additional bloodshed. The next morning brought Catherine's first attempt to leave her bed since the fever had broken. She insisted on sitting in the chair by her window, wrapped in quilts, and determined to write a proper thank-you note to the man who had saved her life. Her handwriting, usually so careful and precise, wavered slightly from weakness, but her words were clear and heartfelt. "Dear Mr. Thatcher," she wrote in her careful script, "thank you for making me well when I was so very sick. Papa says you learned healing from your mother, and I think she must have been a wonderful person to teach you to be so kind and gentle. I hope you find what you're looking for about your father. I will pray for you every day. Your friend, Catherine Ewell." She folded the note carefully and asked her father to deliver it personally. Judge Ewell found himself reluctant to face Thatcher directly. The growing weight of his doubts about the man's guilt made every interaction painful, but Catherine's earnest request could not be denied. When he arrived at the jail, he found Thatcher sitting calmly on his cot, reading from a worn book that Sheriff Morrison had allowed him to borrow from the church library. The big man looked up as the judge approached, and their eyes met through the bars, with an understanding that had grown deeper since Catherine's illness. "She wanted me to give you this," Judge Ewell said, passing the note through the bars. Thatcher read Catherine's words, slowly, and a gentle smile transformed his weathered features. "She has her mother's heart," he said quietly. The comment struck Judge Ewell like a physical blow. "You never knew my wife." "No," Thatcher agreed, "but I can see her influence in Catherine's kindness and wisdom. Children learn compassion from their parents, just as they learn fear and judgment." There was no accusation in his tone, but Judge Ewell felt the sting of implied criticism nonetheless. In his rush to provide swift justice for Samuel Graves' murder, he had indeed shown his daughter an example of judgment without mercy, of law without wisdom. "Catherine is convinced of your innocence," the judge said carefully. "And what do you believe?" Judge Ewell was quiet for a long moment, struggling with the weight of his responsibilities as both a father and a judge. "I believe that the evidence against you is circumstantial at best, and that there are questions about Samuel Graves' death that deserve investigation. But you're not prepared to overturn my conviction. I'm prepared to postpone your execution until those questions can be answered properly." It was a small concession, but it represented the first crack in the wall of certainty that had led to Thatcher's condemnation. Both men understood that postponing an execution was far easier than overturning a conviction, but it at least provided time for the truth to emerge. That afternoon, Sheriff Morrison received an unexpected visitor. Martha Cunningham arrived at his office with information that she had been reluctant to share earlier, fearing the consequences of involving herself in matters that might anger powerful people. "I need to tell you something about the night Samuel was killed," Martha said, her usually confident demeanor showing signs of nervousness. "I saw Marcus Caldwell's foreman, Jake Sullivan, near the general store that evening. He was acting strange, looking around like he didn't want to be seen." Morrison leaned forward intently. "What time was this?" "Around 11:30. Maybe midnight. I was closing up the saloon and happened to look out the back window. Sullivan was in the alley behind Graves's store, and he looked like he was waiting for someone." "Did you see him meet with anyone?" "That's just it. I saw him talking to someone, but I couldn't see who. They were in the shadows between the buildings, but I heard raised voices like they were arguing about something." This corroborated Mrs. Henley's account of voices in the alley, and it placed one of Caldwell's men at the scene of the crime during the crucial time period. Morrison felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture, but he knew he needed more evidence before he could act. "Why didn't you come forward with this earlier?" he asked. Martha's expression grew troubled. "Because Jake Sullivan isn't the kind of man you want to cross, and Marcus Caldwell has too much influence in this territory for a saloon keeper to challenge lightly. But that child nearly died, and the man who saved her is sitting in a jail cell for something he didn't do. Some things are more important than keeping powerful people happy." Her words reflected a growing sentiment in Ravenshoe. The townspeople had witnessed Thatcher's gentle care for Catherine, had seen his healing abilities and quiet dignity, and many were beginning to question their earlier certainty about his guilt. Tom Henderson, the blacksmith who had been among the loudest voices calling for swift justice, approached Sheriff Morrison later that day with his own confession of doubt. "I've been thinking about that big fellow," Henderson said, his massive hands fidgeting with a piece of iron rod. "A man who can heal a child, the way he did, that's not the kind of man who kills for no reason. Maybe we were too quick to judge." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the town. Dr. Hamilton had become an advocate for Thatcher's medical knowledge, praising the effectiveness of his treatments and the sophistication of his understanding. Reverend Patterson spoke from his pulpit about the Christian duty to seek truth and practice mercy, though he was careful not to directly challenge the judge's authority. Meanwhile, Marcus Caldwell was becoming increasingly agitated by the delay in Thatcher's execution. He made several visits to Sheriff Morrison's office, each time pressing for the sentence to be carried out immediately. "Justice delayed is justice denied," Caldwell argued. "The longer this drags on, the more people will begin to question proper legal proceedings. You can't let sentiment override law and order." But Morrison was no longer listening to Caldwell's arguments with the same respect he had shown earlier. The rancher's eagerness to see Thatcher hang, combined with the evidence placing his foreman at the scene of the crime, had shifted Morrison's suspicions in a new direction. "We've uncovered some irregularities in the investigation," Morrison told Caldwell carefully. "It's possible that Samuel Graves' murder was more complicated than we initially thought." Caldwell's pale blue eyes grew cold. "What kind of irregularities?" "Evidence that suggests Graves might have been killed to prevent him from revealing certain information about Thatcher Cain's parentage." The reaction was subtle but unmistakably a slight tightening around Caldwell's eyes, a barely perceptible pause before he responded. To someone who hadn't been watching carefully, it might have passed unnoticed, but Morrison had been watching very carefully indeed. "I can't imagine what Samuel Graves would know about a drifter's family history," Caldwell said dismissively. "You're chasing shadows, Sheriff." But Morrison knew he wasn't chasing shadows anymore. He was tracking something real and dangerous, something that had already cost one man his life and might yet claim others if he couldn't uncover the truth in time. That evening, as Thatcher sat reading Catherine's thank you note by lamplight, he was unaware that his life hung by an even thinner thread than he realized. Caldwell had concluded that the growing questions about the murder could not be allowed to continue. If the sheriff's investigation proceeded much further, it might uncover truths that would destroy everything Caldwell had worked to build. Plans were already in motion to ensure that Thatcher Cain would never have the opportunity to reveal the secrets that Samuel Graves had died protecting. Some solutions, Caldwell believed, were too permanent to be undone by inconvenient investigations or sentimental feelings about innocent children and healing hands. In her room above the courthouse, Catherine slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that her prayers had been answered and that the good man who had saved her life would soon be free to continue his search for his father. She could not have imagined that her innocent questions about family and parentage had set in motion a chain of events that would soon test everyone's commitment to truth and justice. The stage was being set for a final confrontation between those who valued truth above convenience and those who would kill to protect their secrets. And at the center of it all was a gentle giant whose only crime had been seeking to understand his own past that someone had deemed too dangerous to be allowed to surface. The morning would bring new revelations that would force everyone in Ravenshoe to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths, between the safety of ignorance and the danger of knowledge. Some choices, once made, could never be undone, and some secrets, once revealed, would change lives forever. The revelation came in the most unexpected way, hidden among Samuel Graves' personal effects that Sheriff Morrison had been methodically cataloguing. Behind a false bottom in the merchant's desk drawer, Morrison discovered a small collection of items that Graves had apparently considered valuable enough to hide: several gold coins, a few legal documents, and a faded daguerreotype photograph that made the sheriff's hands tremble when he examined it closely. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, standing beside a man in formal clothes that suggested education and position. What made Morrison's breath catch was the unmistakable resemblance between the woman in the photograph and Thatcher Cain. Same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, the same quiet dignity that seemed to transcend the limitations of the old photographic process. But it was the man in the photograph who sent shockwaves through Morrison's understanding of everything that had happened in Ravenshoe. Even 30 years younger, and without the grey hair and lines of responsibility, the face was unmistakably that of Judge Bartholomew Ewell. Written on the back of the photograph in a woman's careful handwriting were the words, "Eleanor and Bartholomew, Spring 1825. May love find a way to overcome all obstacles." Morrison stared at the photograph for long minutes, his mind racing through the implications of what he had discovered. The woman had to be Eleanor Cain, Thatcher's mother. The date made perfect sense 30 years ago, which would align with Thatcher's age. And if Judge Ewell was the man in the photograph, then, "Dear God," Morrison whispered to himself, "Thatcher Cain is Judge Ewell's son." Suddenly, everything made a terrible kind of sense. Samuel Graves' nervous behavior when Thatcher had asked about his father. The mysterious entries in the merchant's ledger about a TC matter. The threats that Graves had received about keeping certain secrets. Someone had killed Samuel Graves to prevent him from revealing that Judge Bartholomew Ewell had fathered a child with a mountain healer 30 years ago, a child who had grown up to be the man the judge had sentenced to hang for murder. Morrison's hands shook as he considered the full scope of the tragedy. A father had condemned his own son to death, not knowing their relationship. Thatcher had come to Ravenshoe searching for information about his parentage, and that search had set in motion the very events that led to his condemnation. But who had killed Samuel Graves to prevent this revelation? And why was Thatcher's parentage worth committing murder to conceal? The answer came to Morrison with sickening clarity. If Thatcher Cain was Judge Ewell's legitimate son, the photograph suggested a relationship that had been serious enough to document, then he would have legal claims that could threaten certain people's interests. Judge Ewell was a man of property and influence, and his inheritance would naturally pass to his children. Marcus Caldwell had business relationships throughout the territory that depended on maintaining the current power structure. If Judge Ewell's long-lost son appeared to claim his rightful place, it could disrupt financial arrangements and property holdings that Caldwell had spent years establishing. Morrison knew he had to confront Judge Ewell with this evidence immediately, but the thought of delivering such devastating news made him reluctant to proceed. How do you tell a man that he nearly executed his own son? How do you explain that the stranger he condemned to die was the child he had never known he had? When Morrison arrived at the Ewell house, he found the judge in his study, reviewing legal documents with the methodical precision that had made him respected throughout the territory. Judge Ewell looked up as Morrison entered, noting the sheriff's grave expression and the manila envelope he carried. "Sheriff Morrison, I trust you have news about your investigation into the irregularities in Samuel Graves' affairs." "I do, Judge, but I'm afraid the news is more complicated than either of us anticipated." Morrison's voice carried a weight that made Judge Ewell set down his papers and give the sheriff his full attention. "What have you discovered?" Morrison placed the photograph on the judge's desk without saying a word. Judge Ewell glanced down at it casually, then his entire body went rigid as recognition struck him like a physical blow. "Where did you find this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Hidden in Samuel Graves' desk. He was keeping it safe, along with other items that someone apparently wanted to remain secret." Judge Ewell picked up the photograph with trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the face of the young woman who had captured his heart so many years ago. Thatcher Cain had been the most beautiful and fascinating woman he had ever met, a mountain healer with wisdom beyond her years and a gentleness that had drawn him like a moth to flame. "This was taken during the spring I spent in the mountains," Judge Ewell said quietly. "I was a young attorney then, recovering from a riding accident. Eleanor cared for me while I healed, and He stopped, unable to continue. "You fell in love with her." "I was young and foolish and completely unprepared for the responsibilities that came with loving someone like Eleanor. When my father summoned me back to civilization to take up my legal career, I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing by leaving. I told myself that a mountain healer and a circuit judge lived in different worlds, that we could never make a life together." Morrison watched the judge's face as the full implications of the photograph's significance began to sink in. "Judge, there's something else you need to know. Eleanor was pregnant when you left, wasn't she?" Judge Ewell's face went white. "Ish never told me. I swear to you, Morrison, if I had known. She had a son, a boy she named Thatcher Cain." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Judge Ewell stared at the photograph, his mind reeling as he tried to process the magnitude of what he was learning. The stranger he had condemned to death, the gentle giant who had saved his daughter's life, was his own Sontha child he had never known existed. "Dear God," he whispered, "what have I done?" "Eleanor raised him alone," Morrison continued gently. "She taught him her healing arts, but she never told him who his father was. Only that he was a good man who had made a difficult choice. Judge Ewell felt the weight of 30 years of missed opportunities crushing down upon him. While he had been building his legal career and raising Catherine, his firstborn son had been growing up in the mountains, learning the healing arts from a mother who had been forced to bear the burden of his abandonment alone. Samuel Graves knew about this. Apparently, the photograph suggests that he was Eleanor's friend, possibly the only person she trusted with the truth about Thatcher's parentage. When Thatcher came to Ravenshoe asking questions about his father, Graves was planning to tell him the truth. And someone killed him to prevent that revelation. That's my belief, yes. Someone who had a vested interest in keeping Thatcher's true identity secret. Judge Ewell's legal mind began working through the implications, even as his father's heart was breaking over the lost years with his son. If Thatcher is my legitimate heir, his claim to my property and position could threaten certain business relationships. Marcus Caldwell has contracts and arrangements that depend on the current power structure remaining stable. Caldwell also has the resources and connections to arrange Samuel's murder and frame Thatcher for the crime. It would eliminate the threat to his interests while removing the one person who could challenge the cover-up. The judge stood slowly, his face aging years in the span of minutes. I have to tell him. I have to tell Thatcher who he is, and I have to find a way to ask for forgiveness that I don't deserve. Judge, there's more. I believe Caldwell is planning to eliminate Thatcher before the truth can come out. If he's willing to commit murder once to protect his secrets, he won't hesitate to do it again. Then we have to act quickly. Judge Ewell's voice carried a new determination, the tone of a man who had found his moral center after years of drifting in uncertainty. I need to see my son. The walk to the jail felt like the longest journey of Judge Ewell's life. Every step carried him closer to a confrontation that would forever change his understanding of himself, his past, and his responsibilities as both a father and a judge. When they reached Thatcher's cell, they found him sitting quietly, reading from the Bible that Reverend Patterson had provided. He looked up as they approached, and Judge Ewell felt his breath catch as he saw his own features reflected in his son's face features that had been there all along, waiting for him to recognize them. "Thatcher," Judge Ewell said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have something to show you. Something that explains why Samuel Graves was killed and why you were framed for his murder." He held out the photograph with hands that shook despite his efforts to remain composed. Thatcher took it carefully, his dark eyes studying the faces of the young couple captured in the faded image. "That's my mother," he said quietly, his finger tracing Eleanor's face with infinite gentleness. "And the man beside her," Judge Ewell said, his voice breaking, "is your father." Thatcher looked up sharply, his eyes meeting Judge Ewell's gaze with an intensity that seemed to burn through the years of separation and misunderstanding. In that moment, both men saw the truth that had been hidden in plain sight, the resemblance that went beyond physical features to encompass something deeper and more fundamental. "You," Thatcher said simply, and it was not a question, but a statement of recognition. "Yes," Judge Ewell replied. "I am your father, and I have spent 30 years not knowing that I had condemned my own son to die for a crime he did not commit." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of lost time, missed opportunities, and the cruel irony of fate that had brought them together under such tragic circumstances. Father and son, judge and condemned man, separated by a lifetime of ignorance and brought together by the very forces that sought to keep them apart forever. Outside the jail, Marcus Caldwell was making final preparations to ensure that the truth would die with the man who embodied it. Some secrets, he believed, were worth any price to protect, even if that price was the life of an innocent man and the soul of the father who would unknowingly destroy his own child. The silence in the jail cell stretched for what felt like an eternity. Father and son staring at each other across 30 years of separation and a lifetime of misconceptions. Judge Ewell felt as though his entire world had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him struggling to find solid ground in a reality that had changed beyond recognition. Thatcher was the first to speak, his deep voice carrying the same calm dignity that had marked all his interactions since arriving in Ravenshoe. "She never told me your name. She said only that you were a good man who had been forced to make an impossible choice, and that someday I would understand. I was young and foolish," Judge Ewell said, his voice thick with regret. "I convinced myself that leaving was the right thing to do, that our worlds were too different to bridge. I never knew if I had known about you." "You would have done your duty," Thatcher said quietly, "just as you did your duty when you sentenced me to hang. You are a man of principle, even when those principles cause pain." Judge Ewell was struck by his son's lack of bitterness, by the understanding and even forgiveness in his voice. Eleanor had clearly raised a remarkable man, someone who could see past his own suffering to recognize the struggles of others. "You don't hate me," the judge said, and it was half statement, half question. "Hate serves no purpose except to poison the heart that harbors it. My mother taught me that healing requires forgiveness, and that forgiveness is not dependent on deserving." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat gently, reminding them of the urgency of their situation. "Judge, we need to discuss what happens next. If I'm right about Caldwell's involvement, Thatcher's life is in immediate danger. A man who's already committed murder to protect his secrets won't hesitate to eliminate the primary threat to his plans." Judge Ewell's legal mind began working through the complexities of their situation. "We need to move quickly to ensure Thatcher's safety, but we also need evidence that will stand up in court. A photograph and suspicious circumstances aren't enough to convict Caldwell of Samuel's murder." "I've been thinking about that," Morrison said. "If we can get Caldwell to reveal his hand, to act in a way that exposes his guilt, we might be able to gather the evidence we need." "You're talking about using me as bait," Thatcher observed with characteristic directness. "It's dangerous," Morrison admitted. "But if Caldwell believes you're still unaware of your true identity, he might attempt to eliminate you in a way that reveals his involvement in Samuel's death." Judge Ewell felt his paternal instincts warring with his judicial responsibilities. The thought of deliberately placing his newly discovered son in danger was almost unbearable. But he also recognized that justice for Samuel Graves required risks that went beyond personal comfort. "There might be another way," Thatcher said quietly. "If Caldwell killed Samuel to prevent him from revealing my parentage, then he's been operating under the assumption that I don't know the truth. What if we let him continue believing that while we gather evidence of his guilt? How do you propose we do that? Catherine's recovery has given us an excuse to delay the execution. If I were to be moved to a less secure location, perhaps to continue treating her, or to help Dr. Hamilton with other patients, it might give Caldwell the opportunity he's looking for, while allowing you to observe his actions." Judge Ewell shook his head firmly. "I won't use you as bait. I've already failed you as a father. I won't compound that failure by deliberately putting you in harm's way. With respect, sir, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm offering to help solve a problem that affects all of us. Samuel Graves died because of me, even if I didn't kill him. I owe it to his memory to see that his real killer faces justice." Morrison studied Thatcher's determined expression and recognized the same quiet courage that had marked his decision to help Catherine, despite knowing it wouldn't save him from the gallows. "If we're going to do this, we need to plan it carefully. Caldwell is intelligent, and ruthless own mistake could cost us everything." Over the next hour, they developed a strategy that balanced the need for evidence with the imperative of keeping Thatcher alive. The plan would require precise timing, careful coordination, and a degree of trust that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances of their recent revelations. Judge Ewell would announce that Thatcher's execution was being postponed indefinitely pending further investigation into irregularities surrounding Samuel Graves' murder. This would give Caldwell reason to believe that his secrets were in danger of exposure, creating pressure for him to act decisively. Thatcher would be moved to a more comfortable holding area in the courthouse basement, ostensibly to allow him to continue providing medical assistance to Catherine and other townspeople who might benefit from his healing knowledge. This would make him more accessible to potential assassins while providing multiple witnesses to any attempt on his life. Sheriff Morrison would maintain surveillance on Caldwell and his associates, looking for evidence of planning or preparation for violence. Dr. Hamilton would be informed of the situation and asked to assist in monitoring Thatcher's safety while maintaining the pretense that he was simply receiving medical consultation. As they finalized their plans, Catherine arrived at the jail with a determined expression that reminded Judge Ewell powerfully of her mother. She had convinced Mrs. Patterson to accompany her, arguing that she needed to thank Thatcher properly for saving her life. "Papa," she said with the directness that often surprised adults, "why does Mr. Thatcher look so much like you?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Judge Ewell felt his carefully planned explanations crumble in the face of his daughter's innocent observation. Children often saw truths that adults worked hard to hide, and Catherine's perceptive eyes had noticed what others had missed. "Catherine," Judge Ewell said gently, kneeling to her level, "there are some things about families that are complicated. Mr. Thatcher is your brother." Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Catherine, however, simply nodded as though this revelation made perfect sense to her 12-year-old understanding of the world. "I thought he might be," she said matter-of-factly. "He has your eyes, and he's kind like you are when you think no one is watching." Thatcher smiled at his half-sister's assessment, and Catherine turned to him with the same direct gaze she had given her father. "Does this mean you'll be staying with us now? I could teach you to read better, and you could teach me about healing." "I'd like that very much," Thatcher replied, though all the adults in the room understood that such a future was far from certain. "But first, we have some difficult things to work through." Catherine accepted this with the pragmatic wisdom that had always marked her character. "Grown-up things are often complicated," she said, "but the important things usually work out if people try hard enough." Her simple faith in the possibility of good outcomes provided a stark contrast to the dangerous realities they were facing. Mrs. Patterson, recovering from her shock, immediately began calculating the social implications of Judge Ewell's revelation. "Judge," she said carefully, "this changes everything about the trial and the execution. The townspeople need to know." "They will know," Judge Ewell said firmly, "but we need to handle this carefully. There are people who have a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden, and premature disclosure could put everyone in danger." As if summoned by the mention of danger, Marcus Caldwell appeared in the doorway of the jail, his pale blue eyes taking in the assembled group with calculating assessment. His arrival was so perfectly timed that Sheriff Morrison immediately suspected he had been watching the jail and waiting for an opportune moment to intrude. "Judge Ewell," Caldwell said with his usual air of authority, "I understand there's been yet another delay in carrying out the execution. The townspeople are beginning to question whether justice will ever be served for poor Samuel's murder." "Justice will be served," Judge Ewell replied evenly, "but only when we're certain we have the right man. New evidence has come to light that suggests the case may be more complicated than we initially believed." Caldwell's expression remained neutral, but Morrison noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "What kind of new evidence?" "Evidence that suggests Samuel Graves may have been killed to prevent him from revealing certain information that someone was willing to commit murder to keep secret." "That sounds like speculation rather than evidence," Caldwell said dismissively. "I hope you're not allowing sentiment about the condemned man's medical abilities to cloud your judgment about his guilt." Catherine, who had been listening to this exchange with growing indignation, suddenly spoke up with the fearless honesty of childhood. "Mr. Caldwell, why do you want Mr. Thatcher to hang so badly? He saved my life, and he's a good man." Caldwell's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the surface. "Child, you don't understand the complexities of adult justice. Sometimes good people do terrible things, and society requires consequences." "But he didn't do anything terrible," Catherine insisted. "He's my brother, and brothers don't kill people for no reason." The word brother hit Caldwell like a physical blow, His carefully controlled expression cracked completely, and for a moment, raw fear and fury showed in his pale eyes. In that instant, everyone in the room understood that Catherine had just revealed the one piece of information that Caldwell had been willing to kill to keep secret. "Your brother?" Caldwell's voice was barely controlled. "Yes," Judge Ewell said, stepping protectively in front of Catherine. "Thatcher Cain is my son, and any attempt to harm him will be met with the full force of the law." Caldwell's mind was clearly racing, calculating the implications of this revelation for his carefully laid plans. If Thatcher's true parentage became public knowledge, it would not only destroy the frame-up that had nearly cost the innocent man his life, it would also raise questions about who had really killed Samuel Graves and why. "This is impossible," Caldwell said, but his protest lacked conviction. "You're letting desperation cloud your judgment." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Actually, we have proof. A photograph that Samuel Graves was keeping safe, showing Judge Ewell and Thatcher's mother together 30 years ago. The same photograph that someone killed Samuel to prevent from being revealed." Caldwell's facade finally crumbled completely. The calculating coldness in his eyes was replaced by the desperate fury of a cornered animal. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but Morrison was ready for the movement. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Morrison said quietly. "There are too many witnesses here, and too many people who know the truth now. Your only chance is to come quietly and hope for mercy from a jury." But Caldwell was beyond rational calculation now. The empire he had built through manipulation and intimidation was crumbling around him, and he could see no future that didn't end in disgrace and ruin. His hand continued its movement toward his weapon, forcing Morrison to draw his own gun. "Get Catherine out of here," Morrison ordered, but the child was already being pulled to safety by Mrs. Patterson. Thatcher, still confined in his cell, watched helplessly as the confrontation escalated. He could see the desperation in Caldwell's eyes, could recognize the signs of a man who had been pushed beyond his breaking point. Violence was coming, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. "Caldwell," Judge Ewell said, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, "you're only making this worse for yourself. Drop your weapon and surrender peacefully." "Peacefully?" Caldwell laughed, and there was genuine madness in the sound. "You've destroyed everything I've worked for. Everything I've built. Do you think I'm going to meekly submit to hanging for protecting my interests?" "You killed an innocent man," Judge Ewell said firmly. "Samuel Graves died because you were afraid of losing your ill-gotten gains. That's not protecting interests. That's murder. Samuel Graves was going to destroy me." Caldwell snarled. "He was going to tell that bastard about his parentage, and everything I've worked for would have been lost. I couldn't let that happen." His confession hung in the air like a death sentence, witnessed by multiple people and eliminating any possibility of denial. But rather than providing relief, the admission only seemed to push Caldwell further toward violence. "If I'm going to hang," he said with terrifying calm, "I'm going to make sure I take some of you with me." The standoff had reached its breaking point, and everyone in the room understood that the next few moments would determine whether justice would be served or whether Caldwell's desperation would claim more innocent lives. Outside, the people of Ravenshoe went about their daily business, unaware that their quiet town was about to become the scene of a final, violent confrontation between truth and the forces that would kill to suppress it. The tension in the jail reached a breaking point as Caldwell's hand hovered over his gun. Sheriff Morrison kept his own weapon trained on the desperate rancher, while Judge Ewell positioned himself protectively near the cell where his son waited helplessly behind bars. "You're making a mistake, Caldwell," Morrison said steadily. "There are too many people who know the truth now. Violence won't solve your problems." "Violence created my problems," Caldwell replied with bitter irony. "Samuel Graves should have minded his own business instead of playing protector to old secrets. And that bastard," he gestured toward Thatcher, "should have stayed in whatever mountain hole he crawled out of." From his cell, Thatcher spoke with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout his ordeal. Marcus Caldwell, I presume. I never had the chance to ask you why my existence threatened you so much that you were willing to kill for it. Caldwell's pale eyes fixed on Thatcher with undisguised hatred. Your existence threatens the natural order of things. Judge Ewell is a man of property and influence, and his inheritance should go to legitimate heirs, not to the bastard offspring of a mountain witch. Catherine is his legitimate heir, Thatcher said quietly. I never came here seeking inheritance or position. I only wanted to know who my father was. And that knowledge would have destroyed everything. Caldwell's voice rose to near shouting. Do you think the territorial legislature would continue to support a judge whose moral character included fathering children with mountain healers? Do you think the business communities would maintain their confidence in his decisions? Your very existence would have undermined the stability that men like me depend on. Judge Ewell felt the weight of his past choices settling on his shoulders like a mantle of lead. Caldwell was right about one thing. The revelation of Thatcher's parentage would indeed create complications for his career and reputation. But the idea that such concerns justified murder was beyond comprehension. So you killed Samuel Graves to protect your business interests, Judge Ewell said, his voice heavy with disgust. I eliminated a threat to the social order, Caldwell corrected. Samuel was weak, sentimental. He let old friendships cloud his judgment about what needed to be done. And you framed my son for the murder. I created justice, Caldwell said with chilling conviction. A dangerous drifter killed a respected merchant. That's a story that serves everyone's interests. The real killer is eliminated. The community feels safe, and inconvenient truths remain buried. Sheriff Morrison had been listening to this exchange while calculating his options. Caldwell was clearly beyond rational negotiation, but the confined space of the jail made any violent confrontation extremely dangerous. One wrong move could result in innocent deaths. Caldwell, Morrison said carefully, you're confessing to murder in front of multiple witnesses. Your only choice now is to surrender peacefully and hope for mercy. Mercy? Caldwell laughed again, and the sound was like breaking glass. From whom? From a judge who's just discovered he nearly hanged his own son. From a sheriff who let an innocent man sit in a death cell while the real killer walked free. From a community that was ready to cheer when that rope snapped his neck. His words struck home with devastating accuracy. Everyone in the room was indeed guilty of rushing to judgment, of allowing fear and prejudice to override careful investigation. The system of frontier justice that they had all believed in had nearly claimed an innocent life. That's exactly why you need to surrender, Judge Ewell said firmly, so that we can begin to make amends for our failures. Justice delayed is not justice denied, if it prevents an even greater injustice. But Caldwell was no longer listening to reason. His carefully constructed world was collapsing, and he could see no future that didn't end in disgrace and ruin. The gun in his hand represented his last chance to control the outcome of events that had spiraled far beyond his ability to manage. If I'm going to hang for protecting civilization from chaos, he said with terrifying calm, then I'm going to make sure the chaos dies with me. The movement came without warning. Caldwell's gun cleared its holster with practiced speed, swinging toward Thatcher's cell. Morrison's own weapon was already drawn, but the angle was wrong, and he couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting the judge. Time seemed to slow as the confrontation reached its crisis. Judge Ewell threw himself sideways, trying to get out of the line of fire, while simultaneously positioning himself between the gun and his son. Thatcher pressed himself against the far wall of his cell, as far from the bars as the confined space would allow. The thunder of gunfire filled the small jail with deafening echoes. Caldwell's first shot splintered wood from the doorframe of Thatcher's cell, missing its target by inches. Morrison's return fire was more accurate, but Caldwell was already moving, using the chaos to his advantage. "This ends now," Caldwell shouted over the ringing in everyone's ears. "The bastard dies, and the secret dies with him." Judge Ewell found himself in the surreal position of literally standing between a gun and his son, his body serving as the only barrier between Caldwell's desperation and Thatcher's life. The irony was not lost on him. The same man he had condemned to death was now depending on him for protection. "You'll have to kill me first," Judge Ewell said with quiet determination. "If that's what it takes," Caldwell replied, and his second shot rang out with deadly intent. But Sheriff Morrison had used the precious seconds to reposition himself, and his own shot took Caldwell in the shoulder, spinning the rancher around and sending his gun flying across the floor. Caldwell stumbled but didn't fall, his remaining hand clutching his wounded shoulder while his eyes burned with undiminished hatred. "It's over, Caldwell," Morrison said, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man. "Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see trial." Caldwell looked around the jail with the desperate calculation of a trapped animal. His eyes fell on the keys to Thatcher's cell, hanging just within reach on Sheriff Morrison's belt. If he could get to those keys, he might be able to use Thatcher as a hostage to negotiate his escape. The wounded rancher lunged forward with surprising speed, his good arm reaching for Morrison's gun belt. The sheriff tried to step back, but the confined space worked against him. Caldwell's fingers closed around the cell keys just as Morrison brought his gun down in a stunning blow that sent the rancher to his knees. But Caldwell's desperation gave him strength beyond reason. With blood streaming from his wounded shoulder and his vision blurred from Morrison's blow, he managed to crawl toward Thatcher's cell, the keys clutched in his good hand. "Stay back," he gasped, fumbling with the lock. "I'll kill him before I let him destroy everything I've built." The final confrontation was at hand, and everyone in the jail understood that the next few moments would determine whether justice would prevail or whether Caldwell's madness would claim one final victim. The keys turned in the lock with a sound like thunder, and the cell door swung open to reveal the wounded, desperate man who would stop at nothing to silence the truth forever. As the cell door swung open, Thatcher found himself face to face with a wounded, desperate man whose pale eyes held the fury of someone who had lost everything he valued. Caldwell's good arm shook as he raised a knife he had pulled from his Booth's backup weapon when the gun had been knocked away. 30 years of planning. Caldwell gasped, blood seeping through his shirt from Morrison's shot. 30 years of building something that mattered, and you walk into my town asking questions that should have stayed buried. Thatcher remained calm, despite the blade inches from his chest. His mother's teachings about healing had included lessons about recognizing when someone was beyond help, not physically, but spiritually. Caldwell had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Thatcher said quietly. "I only wanted to know where I came from. And that knowledge has destroyed everything." Caldwell's voice cracked with exhaustion and pain. "Samuel Graves is dead because of your questions. This town is divided because of your healing. Families are torn apart because of your existence." "Marcus." Judge Ewell's voice carried the authority of decades on the bench, but also the desperation of a father watching his son in mortal danger. "This won't solve anything. Kill him, and you'll still face the gallows. But you'll also have destroyed the last chance for redemption." Caldwell's hand wavered slightly. The physical toll of his wounds was combining with the mental strain of his collapsing world to push him toward complete breakdown. Redemption? For whom? Samuel Graves is still dead. The boy's mother died alone and forgotten. Where's the redemption in any of this? "In stopping the killing," Thatcher said, his deep voice carrying the same calm strength that had marked his healing work. "In allowing truth to serve justice instead of serving vengeance." Sheriff Morrison had been slowly moving closer, but Caldwell's position at the cell door made any intervention extremely risky. One wrong move could drive the knife into Thatcher's heart before anyone could stop it. From somewhere outside the jail came the sound of approaching voices, townspeople drawn by the gunshots. Soon the small building would be filled with witnesses, making Caldwell's situation even more desperate and dangerous. "You hear that?" Caldwell asked with bitter irony. "They're coming to see justice done, to watch the bastard finally get what he deserves. They're coming to see a wounded man surrender to mercy," Judge Ewell said firmly. "To witness the end of a tragedy that has claimed too many victims already." But Caldwell was beyond such appeals, his face contorted with pain and rage as he raised the knife higher, preparing for a strike that would end Thatcher's life and seal his own fate. It was then that Catherine's voice cut through the tension like a blade of pure light. "Mr. Caldwell, please don't hurt my brother." Everyone turned to see the 12-year-old standing in the doorway, her green eyes wide with fear but her voice steady with the kind of courage that only innocence can provide. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her, wringing her hands in distress, but clearly unable to prevent Catherine from entering the dangerous situation. "Child, get away from here," Caldwell commanded, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. Something about Catherine's presence seemed to deflate his fury, replacing it with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I can't," Catherine said simply. "He saved my life. If you hurt him, you'll be hurting the person who made it possible for me to grow up and become the woman my mama wanted me to be." Caldwell stared at the child, his knife hand trembling with more than physical strain. In Catherine's earnest face, he saw an innocence that his actions had helped to preserve. Was alive because of Thatcher's healing abilities that Caldwell had tried to silence forever. "Don't you understand?" he asked, his voice breaking. "He threatens everything that keeps this community stable. His existence challenges the natural order of things." "The natural order," Catherine said with wisdom beyond her years, "is for children to know their fathers, for families to be together, and for good people to help other people when they're hurt. How does any of that threaten anybody?" Her simple logic cut through Caldwell's complex justifications like a knife through silk. All his elaborate reasoning about social stability and natural order crumbled in the face of a child's understanding of basic human decency. The knife in Caldwell's hand slowly lowered as the last of his strength finally gave out. The wound in his shoulder, the emotional strain of his exposed crimes, and the weight of a child's innocent questions combined to break the last of his resistance. "I killed Samuel Graves," he said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I killed him because he was going to tell the truth, and I couldn't let that happen." Sheriff Morrison moved quickly to take the knife from Caldwell's unresisting hand, while Judge Ewell gathered Catherine protectively in his arms. The crisis was over, but the aftermath would require careful handling to prevent additional bloodshed. "Why?" Thatcher asked as Morrison applied shackles to the wounded man. "Why was the truth so dangerous that it was worth killing for?" Caldwell looked up at him with eyes that held nothing but exhaustion and defeat. "Because I built my fortune on Judge Ewell's reputation and influence. If his moral character had been questioned, if his decisions had been challenged because of his past relationship with your mother, everything I owned would have been worthless. So you killed an innocent man to protect your money." "I protected the natural order of things," Caldwell insisted weakly. "The strong rule, the weak serve, and bastard children don't inherit what legitimate heirs deserve." Judge Ewell felt the weight of his own past choices settling on his shoulders like a cloak of lead. Caldwell's crimes were his own responsibility, but they had been made possible by the judge's abandonment of Eleanor and his failure to acknowledge his son. "The natural order," Judge Ewell said quietly, "is for fathers to take responsibility for their children, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. I failed in that responsibility 30 years ago, and that failure made everything that followed possible." Outside the jail, the crowd of townspeople had grown larger. Word was spreading through Ravenshoe that the condemned man was actually Judge Ewell's son, that the real killer had been caught, and that a terrible injustice had been narrowly averted. Dr. Hamilton pushed through the crowd to examine Caldwell's wounds, pronouncing them serious but not life-threatening. The rancher would live to face trial for Samuel Graves' murder, though his empire of manipulation and intimidation had crumbled beyond repair. As Morrison led the wounded prisoner away, Thatcher finally stepped out of the cell that had been his home for what felt like a lifetime. The first person he embraced was Catherine, lifting his half-sister gently and holding her close while she whispered thanks that she was too young to fully understand. The second person he embraced was Judge Ewell, his father-in, a moment of reconciliation that 30 years of separation and several days of mutual condemnation had made seem impossible. "I'm sorry," Judge Ewell whispered, "for leaving your mother, for not knowing about you, for nearly—" "The past is finished," Thatcher said quietly. "What matters now is what we choose to do with the time we have left." And in that moment, surrounded by the people of Ravenshoe, who had learned the hard way that justice required more than swift judgment, a family that had been broken by time and circumstance began the slow process of healing that would define their future together. 3 months later, the autumn sun cast golden light across the main street of Ravenshoe, painting the wooden buildings in warm hues that seemed to reflect the healing that had taken place in the months since Marcus Caldwell's arrest and trial. The town had settled into a new rhythm, one that acknowledged the hard-learned lesson that justice and mercy must walk hand in hand if either was to have meaning. The Ewell family Bible lay open on Judge Ewell's desk, its leather binding worn smooth by generations of hands that had recorded births, deaths, and marriages within its pages. With careful precision, the judge added a new entry in his own handwriting: Thatcher Cain Ewell, son of Bartholomew Ewell and Eleanor Cain, born 1825, acknowledged and welcomed into the family October 1855. The act of writing his son's name in the family record represented more than legal recognition. It was a formal acknowledgement of 30 years of missed birthdays, unshared sorrows, and the countless small moments that make up a father's relationship with his child. But it was also a promise that the years ahead would be different, that the family circle that had been broken by youth and fear would be made whole by wisdom and love. Catherine burst through the door of her father's study with the enthusiasm that had marked her recovery from both illness and the trauma of nearly losing her newfound brother. At 12, she had adapted to the revelation of Thatcher's existence with the resilience that children often display when faced with adult complications. "Papa, Thatcher says the willow bark tea is ready, and Mrs. Patterson's rheumatism is much better after just 3 days of treatment." Catherine's excitement about her brother's healing work had led her to become his unofficial apprentice, learning the basics of herbal medicine with the same intensity she had once reserved for books. "That's wonderful news," Judge Ewell replied, setting down his pen and smiling at his daughter's enthusiasm. The change in Catherine since Thatcher's arrival had been remarkable. Her natural intelligence had found new outlets in learning about healing, and her compassionate nature had flourished under her brother's gentle guidance. Through the window, Judge Ewell could see Thatcher in the garden behind their house, working with Dr. Hamilton to establish a proper medicinal herb garden that would serve the entire community. The partnership between the formally trained physician and the mountain-taught healer had proven remarkably effective, combining the best of both approaches to treating illness and injury. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the street, where Sheriff Morrison was returning from the territorial capital with news of Marcus Caldwell's final sentencing. The trial had been swift but thorough, with Caldwell's own confession supplemented by evidence that painted a clear picture of premeditated murder driven by greed and fear. Morrison dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post before climbing the steps to the courthouse. His expression was grave, but satisfied the look of a man who had seen justice served, even if the process had revealed uncomfortable truths about his own community's rush to judgment. 10 years hard labor, Morrison reported when Judge Ewell met him in the courthouse lobby. The territorial judge said that Caldwell's confession and cooperation in revealing the extent of his illegal business dealings warranted a sentence short of hanging, but that the premeditated nature of Samuel's murder demanded severe punishment. Judge Ewell nodded slowly. Justice had been served, though he found little satisfaction in Caldwell's punishment. The rancher's crimes had been born from the same kind of fear and prejudice that had nearly cost Thatcher his life: the fear of change, the prejudice against those who were different, and the willingness to use violence to preserve comfortable lives. What about his property holdings? Most of it will be sold to pay restitution to Samuel's family and to cover the costs of the investigation. There won't be much left of his empire by the time the territorial government finishes with him. The destruction of Caldwell's business interests had created opportunities for others in the community, but more importantly, it had eliminated the corrupting influence that had distorted local politics and business dealings for years. Ravenshoe was learning to function without the fear and intimidation that had once passed for order. That evening, the Ewell family gathered for dinner with a sense of contentment that had been absent from their lives for far too long. Thatcher had moved into the small room that had once served as Judge Ewell's law library, and his presence had transformed the quiet house into something that felt truly like a home. "Tell us about Mama," Catherine said as they finished their meal, addressing Thatcher with the directness that had always marked her conversations. It had become a nightly ritual, Catherine's questions about Eleanor Cain, and Thatcher's gentle stories about the woman who had raised him with wisdom and love. "Tonight I'll tell you about the time she delivered twins during a blizzard," Thatcher said, his deep voice taking on the storytelling cadence that Catherine loved. "The midwife couldn't reach the cabin because of the snow, and my mother had to manage the birth by herself. She saved both babies and the mother, working through the night with nothing but her knowledge and her faith." Judge Ewell listened to his son's stories about Eleanor with a mixture of pride and regret, pride in the remarkable woman he had loved, and regret that he had not been there to support her through the challenges she had faced alone. Eleanor's death had been lonely and difficult, but her legacy lived on in the son she had raised and the healing knowledge she had passed down to him. "Did she ever talk about Papa?" Catherine asked with the innocent curiosity that often led to the most profound questions. Thatcher glanced at Judge Ewell before answering. "She said that love sometimes requires difficult choices, and that good people can make mistakes that hurt the ones they care about most. But she also said that forgiveness is possible when people are willing to acknowledge their failures and work to make amends." It was Eleanor's wisdom, passed down through her son, that had made the family's reconciliation possible. Without her teachings about forgiveness and healing, Thatcher might have harbored bitterness that would have poisoned any chance for a relationship with his father. As the weeks turned into months, Thatcher's integration into Ravenshoe's community had progressed beyond mere acceptance to genuine respect and affection. His healing abilities had helped dozens of townspeople, from treating Martha's chronic headaches to helping Tom Henderson recover from a serious forge accident. Dr. Hamilton had formally requested that Thatcher be appointed as the town's deputy medical officer, a position that would allow him to practice healing legally while continuing to learn from formal medical training. The appointment had been approved unanimously by the town council, marking the first time in the territory's history that a mountain-trained healer had received official recognition. "You found your calling," Judge Ewell observed one afternoon as he watched Thatcher treating a child's broken arm with a combination of herbal remedies and precise bone-setting techniques that Dr. Hamilton openly admired. "I've found my family," Thatcher replied simply. "The calling was always there, waiting for the right place and people to share it with." The relationship between father and son had developed slowly, built on daily conversations and shared experiences rather than dramatic declarations. They had discovered common interests in reading and philosophy, and Judge Ewell had begun teaching Thatcher about law and legal reasoning, finding in his son a quick mind that grasped complex concepts with surprising ease. Catherine had thrived in her role as the bridge between her father and brother, using her natural diplomatic skills to smooth over the occasional awkwardness that came with building family relationships among adults. Her joy in having a brother had been infectious, spreading throughout the community and helping others accept Thatcher's place in their midst. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after his arrival in Ravenshoe, Thatcher stood in the town cemetery beside the simple headstone that marked Samuel Graves' final resting place. The merchant's murder had been the catalyst for everything that followed: the revelation of family connections, the exposure of corruption, and ultimately, the healing of old wounds. "I'm sorry you died because of my search for truth," Thatcher said quietly to the grave. "But I promise that your death wasn't in vain. The truth you died protecting has made healing possible, and healing is what my mother always said was the most important work anyone could do. Judge Ewell joined his son at the graveside, carrying flowers that Catherine had picked from their garden. Together, they placed the blooms on Samuel's grave, a gesture of respect for the man whose death had nearly destroyed them all, but had ultimately brought them together. "Do you ever regret coming to Ravenshoe?" Judge Ewell asked, as they walked back toward town. Thatcher considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that people died and suffered because of choices that were made long before I was born. But I don't regret finding my family, even under such difficult circumstances. Some journeys are worth taking regardless of the pain they involve." As they reached the main street of Ravenshoe, they could see Catherine waiting for them on the courthouse steps, a book in her hands and a smile on her face that seemed to light up the entire town. She had grown in the past year, not just physically, but in wisdom and understanding, shaped by the experience of nearly losing people she loved and learning the value of forgiveness and second chances. "Are you ready for our reading lesson?" she called to Thatcher, holding up the book they had been working through together. Despite his natural intelligence, Thatcher's education had been interrupted by the practical demands of mountain life, and Catherine had taken on the task of improving his reading with the dedication of a born teacher. "Always ready to learn from my teacher," Thatcher replied, and the genuine affection in his voice reflected the deep bond that had developed between the siblings, despite their very different upbringings. Judge Ewell watched his children with the contentment of a man who had finally learned to value what truly mattered. His legal career would continue, but it would be informed by the hard-learned lessons about the difference between law and justice, between swift judgment and careful consideration of truth. The town of Ravenshoe had learned its own lessons in the year since Thatcher's arrival. The gallows that had been built for his execution had been dismantled, its wood used to build a new school where Catherine now helped teach younger children to read. The community had discovered that true security came not from quick punishment of outsiders, but from the harder work of understanding, forgiveness, and building connections that could withstand the challenges of frontier life. As the sun set over the mountains where Thatcher Cain had lived and died in solitude, her son stood surrounded by the family and community she had never known, but had somehow prepared him to embrace. The healing that had begun with herbs and fever had expanded to encompass broken relationships, wounded hearts, and a town's understanding of what justice truly meant. The gentle giant who had arrived in Ravenshoe as a stranger, searching for his past, had become the cornerstone of a future built on the recognition that every person's story mattered, that every family's healing was worth pursuing, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine was simply the willingness to see others as they truly were, rather than as we feared them to be. In the end, Thatcher Cain had found more than his father. He had discovered his place in a world that had room for both healing hands and gentle hearts. The mountain wisdom his mother had taught him had taken root in fertile soil, growing into something that would benefit generations yet to come. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when Catherine read aloud from her favorite books and Judge Ewell worked on legal briefs that now carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, the Ewell family knew that they had been transformed by forces larger than any of them had imagined. Love, it turned out, was indeed strong enough to overcome the obstacles that fear and misunderstanding had placed in its path. The story of the giant cowboy who had nearly hanged for murder but instead healed a judge's dying daughter had become more than just local legend. It had become a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of truth, and the miraculous healing that could occur when people chose to see beyond their prejudices to the humanity that connected them all. In Ravenshoe, justice and mercy had learned to walk together, and the future stretched ahead with the promise that some wounds, no matter how old or deep, could indeed be healed by hands guided by wisdom, hearts filled with forgiveness, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved the chance to find their way home.